36 million people unemployed. 40% of families who have a worker that makes $40,000 a year and less lose their job last month. 4 million people didn't pay their rent, and the Republican Party says, we don't have any money to help you. Are you kidding me? Where do you guys live?
美国名嘴愤怒咆哮。
第一名场面
They're taking over Chinese. Ni hao ma. Shi shi ni. Chinese. It's too late. It's too late to learn Chinese. It's over. No, it's true. It's true. Because it's also one of the hardest languages in the world. I mean, how do you learn Chinese now? Just, they've got over 10,000 characters in the alphabet. You know this? 10,000 characters. We've got 26 in English. And there's still people going, what comes after Q? 26. This is, 10,000 they've got. That's super smart. Although they must have the worst Sesame Street in the world. It must suck being a Muppet in that country. I can just see them on a Monday morning singing to the kids. 5 years later. It's just horrible.
第二名场面
The Chinese don't know that we can't land a spaceship on the dark side of the moon? Do you think the Russians don't know that for the first time since John Glenn was sent up to orbit this planet, America cannot put a person into space without asking the Russians to do it? That we're not investing in the young generation of Americans? That we're willing to lose the race for artificial intelligence to the Chinese when China is rising? The China's GDP has quadrupled since 2001, tripled since 2003, doubled since 2009. Do we think that no one in the rest of the world knows all of that about us? For 10 years. For 10 years, Madam President. And now we're here with the government shutdown over his broken promise while the Chinese are landing spacecraft on the dark side of the moon. That's what they're doing.
第三名场面
Ports in the world, how many do you think are in China? Well, let me tell you. 7. How many do you think are in the United States? None. How many do you think are in Europe? None. It's remarkable what is happening here. Now, is it remarkable in some senses? Yes, of course it is, but we go back to this point, that China has been a dominant economic power through human history. It comes because of the Central Plain, which I was walking right across between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. It's an immensely fertile plain. It's surrounded by hills which protect it from...
第四名场面
Let's look at China, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Their handling of coronavirus has been far more efficient, far more effective than the advanced countries of the world. And one country which stands out, and we are very grateful today that the whole House has taken this initiative to pass a resolution supporting China, because China has proven to be an all-weather friend, has stood by Pakistan, and they have been a success story. China ने क्या किया, Mr. Chairman? जो बर्तानिया ने नहीं किया, जो इटली ने नहीं किया, जो स्पेन ने नहीं किया, जो यूएस ने नहीं किया. They had declared decisive leadership. उनका प्रेसिडेंट शी जिनपिंग, उनका प्रीमियर ली केचियांग, उन्होंने फैसला कर लिया ठक ठक ठक. ये नहीं कोई डिबेट की उन्होंने, कर्फ्यू है, स्मार्ट लॉकडाउन. It's like saying a woman is half pregnant. ये करें या ये न करें. आधा जीतर आधा बटेर, उन्होंने नहीं किया. They went for it. 76-day lockdown. 60 million people. वुहान शहर की आबादी है 11 million. जिस प्रोविंस का वो कैपिटल है हुबे का, उसकी आबादी है 60 million. कंप्लीट लॉकडाउन. ठक वो बंद किया. हॉस्पिटल उनके पास कमी हुई. They built 2 hospitals in 12 days. 40,000 workers worked day and night. In 12 days, 2 state-of-the-art hospitals were built. और क्या हुआ? पूरे चाइना से मेडिकल वर्कर्स आ गए. 42,000 doctors, nurses, specialists, technical people and volunteers. And what did they do? They use smart technology in China. Cell phone. Category कर दी. Red, मतलब आप खतर में हैं, आपका restriction. Yellow, green, you are fine. And yellow, कि अभी आपकी testing होनी है. And free and mass.
第五名正面
Suddenly no longer has strategic thinkers to guide America into a new world where America becomes number two. So these three big strategic mistakes, I think explain why the American population today is a very troubled population and feels very insecure about the world. I wouldn't say that China has been making strategic mistakes, but I think it has been making some tactical mistakes. I think there was a point after the great global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when some Chinese policymakers saw how badly the American and European economies performed in that crisis. And China, as you know, sailed through the crisis and continued to grow significantly. I think there were some Chinese policymakers also became overconfident and became a bit too pushy in their relationships with some of their neighbors. And as a consequence of that, some of the neighbors of China were a bit alarmed by China's behavior. But the good thing about China is that Chinese policymakers learn very fast and change course. And you now notice that China's relations with its neighbors have improved again after going through a slight rough.
第六名正面
So I just want to, what I'm trying to convey here, I hope with some success, is that China ain't like us. I don't mean there's nothing in common, I don't mean we're not part of humanity, but its historical development is so different. And you've got to remember, you know, that we're very recent compared with China. I mean, China is the longest continuously existing polity in the world. Going back, well, arguably, it's one of the first, you know, one of the first settled with the fertile crescent, first settled agriculture in the world. So China has a very, very long history, and maybe instead of people being surprised about China's rise now, this is the wrong way of looking at it. What we should be surprised about, maybe, is not the period since 1978, but what the hell went wrong between 1800 and 1949. Because for the most of the rest of the thousands of years of Chinese history, it was arguably one of, and often the most advanced country in the world. So you could say this is a return to what China is, and Chinese think of it as. We are
第七名正面
They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
And well, because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I mean, I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom. The Chinese never asked Apple to go to Shenzhen and produce all the iPhones. It was Steve Jobs that decided that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was not China that went to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they buy a third of your national debt. If they hadn't bought it, you would be in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure. We would like to build some new airports.
第八名正面
China can solve most of its problems. And if it will solve most of its problems, then, for example, if you take the present percentage of the population in the world, which lives in high-income economies, by World Bank definition, is 16%. Right. China is 19% of the world's population. China should be able to become a high-income economy in about 12 years' time. This will more than double the percentage of the population of the world living in high-income economies. Now, I understand that Chinese people understand that this is a big step forward for China, which it is, obviously. Right. But it's also a big step forward for the human race. Right. I understand that that's not why people, I'm interested in this, that China is the place in the world where the biggest step forward for humanity can be taken.
第9名场面
Chinese, the way the Chinese think of themselves, what it means to be Chinese, the way they think of what China is not a function of the last 100 years of being a nation state. It is a function of more than 2,000 years of being a civilization, or what I call a civilization state. China is primarily not a nation state. It is primarily a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about things like Confucian values, very unusual relationship, very unusual, unique, not unusual, unique relationship in many ways between the state and society. Very unusual conception of the family. Social customs like guanxi, ancestral worship, an ideographic language, Chinese food, chopsticks. I mean, all these things are not a function of the last 100 years. Now, here you have an absolutely basic difference between China and Western countries. Western countries are constituted on the basis, fundamentally or predominantly, varies from country to country, but always predominantly on the basis of national identity, on the basis of nation state. China is different. China is first and foremost constituted on the basis of civilization.
第10名场面
Very poor. Now we're not poor, and some are middle class, some are even wealthy. So what a fantastic story for mankind, and what a good lesson for other countries.
In the last 10 years, the U.S. has been building 500-mile stretch of high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles. It was supposed to be finished by 2017. And many people think the answer is never going to be finished. So in those 10 years, how much high-speed rail did China lay down that's working today? I guess 16,000. And before the 500 miles is finished in the U.S., how much more will be in China? Another 16,000 at least.
So in my book, Destined for War, I have in the first chapter called The Rise of China. And I give a short version of a quiz that I give to my students at Harvard. And the question for the heading is called, When Could China Become Number One? And students guess 2030, 2040, and then I show them a second chart which says already. China is already number one. So not only rival the U.S., but surpass the U.S., including as the largest economy in the world, when measured by the best yardstick for comparing national economies, purchasing